When you think of the democracy in the state that brought us Barack Obama, I think that's a very fine thing. It costs millions and millions and millions of dollars to elect that. So we're talking about economic democracy. And it's the point of those that have the gold make the rules. And in this society, the wealth and the media form the opinions of how people vote. But I'd like to go further into Comrade Tanner's political party and mine, and I have a deep respect for his deep beliefs in democracy, which is similar to my own. Is our Labor Party democratic, Comrade Lindsay?
I thought that it was John who was answering the questions.
Yeah, glad you got that
one. I'll answer briefly, then hand over to John. The answer is imperfectly so. I've been involved in campaigning within the Labor Party for many years, on and off, for more democratic internal arrangements. They're better than some parties that I could name. They fluctuate from state to state, from time to time. We've had some problems in recent times in the Victorian branch of the ALP, but mass political parties are a long way from perfect. John.
Thanks. I'll stand back from Victorian Labor Party politics, which I've followed for quite a long time, I have to say. But to say that this book is, among many other things, is an attempt to alert readers, to fill them with a sense of reverence for the simple point that democracy is a highly unusual form of handling power. I'm speaking abstractly, not about Victorian Labor Party politics. And it's unusual because, if you think about it, through its various historical forms, democracy has remained a form of government in which the means of deciding who shall get what, when, and how are publicly owned. Democracy is a form of public ownership of the means of handling power, of making decisions, of reversing decisions, of retaining things, of moving forward. Public ownership. And I tried to write this book so as to avoid and actually dig the boots in to reductionist views of democracy, which have enjoyed popularity rising and falling in recent decades, have a history going back into the 19th century, which says, Marx, that actually all this talk of democracy or democratic institutions are basically rooted ultimately in who owns property. I don't like that, and I think there are a lot of intellectual and political and historical objections to that. Now, having said that, the history of representative democracy, I'll leave out the Greeks and the Syro-Mesopotamians, is a history in which the championing of democracy, of representative democracy, initially comes from propertied classes. I think that's roughly the pattern. And so those who have money and wealth are the champions of the view that actually they need to protect their money and wealth through forms of government that can prevent monarchic despotism where they'll be robbed. And that's fine, except that democracy is about public ownership, the equality principle. And it's in the 19th century that this contradiction between inequality based on wealth and money on the one hand, and public ownership of the means of decision-making on the other, comes to crunch time. And it gives rise to a remarkable mutation called social democracy. The word first appears at the end of the 1830s and early 1840s. I give the example of a Berlin craft worker, journalist, who is among the first to speak about Sozialdemokratie, and it fills a lot of people with fear, rightly so, because it says democracy can only function, public ownership of the means of decision-making and handling power can only function if there is an equalization of wealth and income. And this is the story of the birth of cooperatives and trade unions, the struggle for trade unions, for trade union presses, and the birth of labour parties, and we had the first. national Labour Party in the world happened here in Australia. Now, what has become of that tradition of social democracy? Was another, professorial way of putting your question and avoiding Victorian Labour Party politics. But I think the good news is that the 30-year period that resulted in a ginormous bubble, the 30-year period of deregulation, of marketization of the belief that actually more space for markets would make people freer and it would dynamize economies and everybody would be happier, that's, I think, coming to an end. And it's coming to an end for very good reasons. And I would say that your question, the old legacy of social democracy, is now back on the agenda again, because all actually existing democracies, United States, UK certainly, and there's a problem here, are becoming hourglass societies, where there is a bottom stratum of people who are left out. Nearly a third of young people in Britain under 18 are living in, officially, statistic, in poverty. That's very bad for democracy. And the losers, and combined with a middle classes are feeling nervous. In Britain, the opinion polls show that for the first time since the 50s, large numbers of middle-class people are worried about the future. They think actually they might become poorer, and they actually have reached the conclusion that their kids will not be better off. And so the property question, the question of income and wealth and distribution comes back. And I think, in this sense, you can see that the Obama fight for in effect, a socialization of medicine, American style. We're going to witness an almighty battle this autumn in the Northern Hemisphere, and I think it's one of the opening shots in a new politics of redistribution. For democracy, I think it's vital that this question of income and wealth and who gets what, when and how, and dental care and health care and education, all these questions are becoming really, really important. What I worry about is that Labour parties in many parts of the world, I don't mention Victoria, have actually stopped asking this question. And, well, if Obama loses, if there is no healthcare reform in the United States, that's a major setback, I think, for this vision. So, yeah.
Further questions?
I was just wondering about whether you see any, I haven't read your book yet, but whether you see any issues about sort of a return to mercantilism or anything like that with the rise of sort of corporate military and things like that. Because your book's called The Rise and Death of Democracy. I'm wondering whether you see anything in that sort of it. If you understand my question.
Go again.
So,
a little bit more.
Yeah, well, we're seeing a huge rise in sort of corporate military and outsourcing of military around the world, even through UN and peacekeeping missions and things like that, especially within the United States. And then when you look back on, as you were talking about with India before, with sort of basically trading companies operating in these nations, sort of there's a huge rise of corporations representing basically, making up the top 10 list of countries in the world outside, 3 or 4 of them. So do you see that maybe there's a threat to, and corporations are completely undemocratic, but do you see that there could be a return in the future to sort of more of a corporate-run societies and things like that? I know it sort of borders on the idea of fascism, but sort of because we're outsourcing to corporations and they're becoming so powerful, I was just wondering what your views were on that as a threat to democracy, as part of death to democracy.
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I probably have softer, woollier, more bourgeois views than you about this, but that was a joke that fell flat on its face. I mean, 2 things about militarization. In the history of democracy, there have been 3 democratic empires: Athens, revolutionary France, and the United States. Britain was not a democratic empire. The whole language of Pax Britannica is to do with Christianization and civilization. Only at the very end is there talk of democratization, and then very reluctantly. And the experience, historical record, shows that democratic empires typically, in the Athenian and French case, get bogged down in deep trouble because it's oxymoronic. I mean, to run an empire and to back it with violence is inconsistent with the principles of open, democratic, egalitarian power sharing. And the United States is faced with, we are living through a long drama. In Europe, I think the feeling is that it's in decline, and probably we're entering now already into an age of bipolarity with China and so on, and so we watch that dynamic. And it has always been, democratic empires have always been a dangerous dynamic, the cause of the death of democracy. That's the haunting thought. As far as corporations are concerned, I mean, I think the way you spoke with respect sounds as if it's the end of the 19th century or early 20th century. It's either the robber barons, it's the big bosses. And there are plenty of those about. But there are corporations and corporations, and there's Microsoft, as well as arms manufacturers. And I don't think you should just lump all of this together. And not only that, but in different regions of the earth, Ralph Dahrendorf many times pointed it out, British capitalism is not German capitalism because of different regulatory systems. This is the point, that democracies have invented ways of handling, regulating corporate power more or less successfully. And it's true that deregulation has been all the flavor of the last several decades. But the post-45 period, this is the qualifier, has seen the erection of institutional barriers and regulatory systems. You may not like them, but they are impinging on corporate power, and the leading one, and I think it's entirely new in the history of democracy, is the Kyoto-Bali-Copenhagen process. Here is a global process which involves the development of new institutional mechanisms for monitoring, scrutinizing the exercise of corporate power, trying to rein in the most destructive effects, the destruction of the biosphere through corporate activities, and trying to find means of making consensus openly without violence. Now, it may all end in tears in Copenhagen. It's not the end. But it's something new in the history of democracy. You could speak, I'll live to regret this, that you could speak about the democratization of corporate power, an instance of the democratization of corporate power in this Copenhagen process. This is new, and we need to think about it with fresh eyes. I don't think we're living in an age in which, unregulated transnational corporate power acts like, a big cigar with boss. There's a lot of that, it's true. But there's also a regulatory framework and a political process, including the involvement of citizens and forms of resistance, like Live 8, like Make Poverty History, that are also new in the history of democracy. It represents a difference from the age of representative democracy because democratic ideals and the attempt to build democratic mechanisms are now creeping across borders because we face a growing number of problems that cannot be handled by territorial states alone. This is new in the history of democracy, and one should cheer up a bit about that.
I'll take one more question as we're getting into the well beyond our time zone, and I think we've had a tremendous evocation of the themes in John's book. So again,
can the Minister for Melbourne be thrown out of a public building? I
probably can.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's one of the aspects of democratic society. Right down the middle,
right.
3/4 of the way at the back.
I'd like you to give advice to Lindsay Tanner on how Australia should elect its first president and what the powers of that president should be.
Yeah, I knew this was coming, and could be the end or the beginning of our friendship. I'm not sure. Well, let me put it this way. I'm coming back to Australia to fight the good fight. I've taken the King's Shilling, and I'll be the Professor of Politics at Sydney from next July. And I have a strong interest in reforms and the future of reforms, the strengthening, the reinvigorating of democracy in Australia. We ought to be proud of it, but we also ought to be critical of things, unfinished business. And in my view, I'll be very blunt, the Howard years were bad for democracy, and they bothered me intensely, and I could have lived with only great difficulty here. I think a change of government has been good, but it has put on the agenda, I think, a whole package of possible reforms, of which the Republic is one. I mean, I think probably not to fudge the point or to let you off the hook, but to think, I can think of a couple of handfuls of reforms that are now seriously on the table. I think the reconciliation process, I think, the invention of new mechanisms for saying sorry, much more at the local level with citizens themselves involved, of a politics of shame, a politics of asking forgiveness, an attempt to build some kind of new solidarity with our Indigenous peoples. I think that is crucially important, and that has only just begun. By the way, in the history of democracy, the politics of remembering is something really new since 1945, and the whole truth reconciliation process, it's a Central American invention, famously popularized in South Africa, and we can do a version of that. So that's one element, if you like, in the equation. I think that a Bill of Rights, much discussed recently, is critically important. There is one in ACT, and you have one here in Victoria. A federal version of this would greatly change. I think it would deepen, it would make more complicated democracy in Australia, but it's on balance it will be a very good thing. We come to other reforms. There are a lot of piecemeal changes and strengthening of accountability and integrity of the kind documented in the recent paper by the Anna Bligh government, recently released. I welcome those, because I think one of the great dangers that exists with all actually existing democracies is the disaffection with parties and the decline of party membership and the weakness of Parliament. It's very bad for democracy. It has a certain end of 19th century feel about it. And I think what Anna Bligh has done in this paper is to put on the agenda a kind of spreadsheet where we take stock of what we've achieved and a lot of unfinished business. I think in the field of foreign policy, every democracy has to think carefully about how it's going to live its democracy within a geopolitical framework. And I'm very glad that there is a compass swing that's been going on since the Keating years. Big setback with Howard, big thought that bilateralism all the way with the USA would solve every problem. Fortunately, that's gone, and I think what multilateralism means and what institution building in the Asia-Pacific region means for Australia is really one of the great political questions. I'd like to see a regional parliament, and of the European Parliament kind. It would really make a difference if China and India and Taiwan and so, well, Taiwan would be a difficult question, and Indonesia were involved in this. And that leaves the Republic. I think that it's good, it's on the agenda, it's going to happen if the Rudd government is re-elected. There's no doubt about that. There will be a referendum. And I would say, I'm being a bit playful, that one of the positive contributions of Howard to Australian democracy is that he bashed up the referendum last time round, and he gave space and time to actually think about it in a more complicated way and to do it more radically. And that partly means, I think, reassessing our Republican tradition. I'm on record as having said rather unkind things about our Republican tradition. It was macho, it was nationalist, it had a strong fascination with blood and violence, and none of that actually has anything, any role to play, I think, in the 21st century. But the replacement of Queen Elizabeth or Charles by an elected head of state I think in presidential form is absolutely necessary, but my view is that it ought to be conceived within a wider package of reforms, and that would change the meaning of republicanism. I think the effects of this long, drawn-out resistance to monarchy is probably good for us as Australians. I mean, we straighten our spines, and I hope there will be a great celebration on the day that we know that Charles will be robbed on the finishing line of becoming King of Australia. But don't suppose that that will solve all problems. I think the Republic question, you see, I favour a directly elected version. I think it's more politically viable, actually, because if you put it to Australians that a parliament, pollies, will elect a head of state, that's a turn-off. So a directly elected head of state, yes, but the president, who will have more or less the same powers, might even have fewer powers because all these other changes, if they begin to happen, will actually change the meaning of a president. A president will have to take note of rights, of a Bill of Rights, and will have to play a role in the reconciliation process, and will have to play a role in a new geopolitical framework. I think that's entirely new, and it's certainly not, Henry Lawson's view of what a republic was going to be. I don't know if that helps you or not.
Well, I'm also a direct electionist, but sadly we'll have to bring tonight's conversation to an end, and it's been fascinating, it's been delightful, and I hope everybody present tonight has enjoyed it as much as I have, and I certainly think that it's a tremendous thing that John is returning to Australia, and I've got no doubt that from July next year he'll be making a very substantial contribution to public debate in this country. We've seen a snapshot of it tonight, we've seen snapshots from his book. For those of you who haven't read the book or haven't obtained a copy, I'd certainly recommend it highly to you. Can I thank John particularly for his contribution tonight, everybody else for attending, and can I ask you please to show your appreciation to Professor John Keane. Thank you very much. Have a good night.